you talk, it gives rise to a totally new way of doing psychology, okay, which I now, in my recent book, I'm really delineating. It's called mental behaviorism. And then what that says is, hey, we should be clear that our constructs are very fuzzy based on the structure, the epistemological structure, almost anti-ontological structure. So it makes that prediction. And then it makes the prediction that if you take a UTOC lens, we can see that fuzziness and then pull a through line through constructs, tie them together, and then have much more clarity about their ontology. So I just want to make that as a general point. A lot of the dissertations that I supervise in my doctoral for my doc students are about that. So we have done this with dreams. We've done this with interpersonal violence. Okay. We just did it with borderline personality disorder. We just did it with psychological mindfulness. All right. So there's a method here that says, hey, you can assimilate and integrate key concepts. All right. The first concept I ever did was depression. Okay. So now we ask, what is depression? In fact, I'm going to put out a little video on what Jordan Peterson gets right and wrong about depression. Okay. And actually he's a great person to go to in this regard. I mean, not without getting entangled. He's a good theoretical clinical psychologist. Okay. And if you listen to him, he's like, hey, you got a dopamine structure. There's weird stuff going on with serotonin. There's an evolutionary status dynamic. There's all sorts of biomedical stuff that can go wrong and influence it. There's also shit that happens in your problems in living. And it's really just this sort of cluster. And what we call depression is really funky. And then he gets all hesitant. Okay. And that's right in terms of, that's a nice articulation of where we are and the various facets. What's wrong is just the ontology. Our ontology is all off. Okay. The reason our ontology is all off, A, problem of psychology, and then B, the way we try to apply the world, where basically depression is situated in a medical context, psychiatry, which then looks at the world in terms of distress and dysfunction and then disease, and then affords us this idea that, oh, depression as part of a medical complex must be a disease, meaning implying that there's broken biology in its cause. Okay. And then so when you grab a hold of depression as having potentially broken biology, which by the way, I think there's some probably do, but also is much more than that in many cases doesn't, then you get this confusion. And this is what Jordan Peterson really gets. Well, do we diagnose, if you live under a bridge as a homeless person and are miserable, and then you score high in depression, are you depressed? Well, I did studies on what psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, no one agrees on that basic question. Why not? Because some people are walking around with the biological, ideological model and meaning, oh, well, if you have obvious problems in living, okay, that cause the sadness, then obviously that's just normal sadness. In fact, there's a bereavement exemption always been. If you're just lost your child 3 weeks ago and you can't sleep and you're crying all the time and your own life has any meaning, we're going to slap a depression diagnosis on you. Okay. And they don't. But it's also the case, what if you're homeless? Well, they do act. There's no homeless. Okay. So anyway, there's this unbelievable cluster of confusion because we don't know. Medicine needs a way to categorize it. It sort of does and sort of doesn't. Okay. And that's just sort of, that's a diagnosis of all the confusion. UTOC comes along with behavioral investment theory and says, oh, depression is a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Okay. That's what it is. And now so many people listen, of course that's what it is. It's like, yeah, okay. Only now is it, of course, what it is. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you take the logic of behavioral investment, okay, means that say you have energy, desire, and drive, you're going to expend it towards particular work effort to get a return on that effort. Okay. If you fail to get the return on the investment, you're going to get frustration and energize yourself more. Okay. If you can't avoid pain, you're going to get anxious and you're going to try to avoid more. If frustration and anxiety do not alleviate, okay, do not alleviate the problem, the next best thing you do is you give up and emotionally hibernate and hope that it passes. And ideally, you're actually situated in a network of relations that says, hey, I am sick. and I need to shut down, help me. So it's actually a communicative structure for social primates to say, come take care of me. Other animals will just go hibernate. Okay. So what am I saying? I'm saying, oh, its system shuts down. Okay. By design. Well, then how does it do that? Well, actually, the way you would shut a behavioral system down at its core is that you jack up the negative affect system and its reactivity so that it's identifying threat and problems high. And what the key of depression is an anhedonia. You pull down the desire approach pleasure system so that it's no longer even seeing possibilities for investment. It's just going to sit on seeing possibilities for threat and hibernate while this is, hopefully the system goes over, because you've already done frustration and anxiety. Okay. And so then the system downgrades itself into, you are psychologically sick. By the way, depression is essentially a organism to animal sick mode. Okay. That says there's no good passive investment for you to be taken care of. Shut down, send some signals that you're in trouble. Okay. And then sit. And so you don't feel like doing shit. You feel like shit because it's a bad scenario. You don't feel like doing shit because especially the initiation of behavioral activity gets undercut by depression. So depression turns off the initiation switch. That's why it's so hard to get out of bed, so hard to start stuff when you're depressed. It causes you to anticipate problems and things. So you see things as pointless. You feel helpless. You feel hopeless. The justification system goes right on this and starts an iterative ruminative process. Okay. So now you look at all the symptoms of depression. First off, there's a biological shift. Normally, you get hypersomnia, more sleeping, less eating. Interestingly, those things can be disrupted. Depends on the situation, depends on the person. You get fatigue. All depression has to have either the jack up of the negative affect system or the pull down of anhedonia. Virtually all of them have both. This is the epicenter. Okay. So you get all of the symptoms now being organized functionally by this really simple description. Okay. And then you put it in an animal mental behavioral context, and you're like, well, what causes shutdown? Well, then you have three broad categories immediately present themselves. Okay. One is the shit of the world that Jordan Peterson would talk about. And I would talk about like if I was on the train to Auschwitz, okay, train to Auschwitz, you're fucking depressed. I mean, you're just muted probably and just can't believe it and in denial. And what else are you doing? And the reason is the entire system now has collapsed. Your entire system of behavioral investment is taken away from you. And you are now on the path to full-fledged suffering with nothing you can do about it. That if you take an inventory, a Beck depression inventory on the train of Auschwitz, the average score is going to be in the depressed range. And we're not going to give diagnoses to these people. This is what's called a depressive reaction. If your kid dies, okay? And I would argue if your entire life starts imploding because you have alcohol problems, you can't get a job, you end up homeless. I mean, come on. Right? You end up in prison. There are a lot of things that can constrain and create a depressive reaction, what I call, which is in line with the problems of living and makes perfect sense that you're shutting down. This is why, the way, so many people wouldn't diagnose a homeless person because it makes perfect sense. Okay. We should just have a classification that says, I think this is a depressive reaction where the shutdown is in line with the developmental difficulties that this person has. It's okay. We are complicated biological creatures, okay? You can get strokes, for example, mini strokes, all right? Mini strokes and other kinds of things can cause that positive and negative affect system to get broken in particular ways. There are things that give rise to what I would call depressive diseases, okay? The biologic can break. And there are some cases that are so pervasive where it's like, oh my God, I think this entire system is essentially shifted into what I would call a melancholic depression that can only really be best explained in the culture and the family or whatever. This person is in a place of melancholic depression. That's a depressive disease. Okay, so now we have and historically you have reactive and endo, and this depressive disease would be endo, meaning within the person, reactive meaning to what's going on. There's another category that's most obvious, what I call neurotic depressions. Okay. Now, neurotic depressions emerge when the behavioral investment, influence matrix, and justification systems in the biological primate organism are behaving totally normally, but they are behaving maladaptively, okay? That creates a reciprocal narrowing, to use John's term, and dead ends you into the world. And I see this all the time in the clinic room. Okay. So how does this work? People get injured. Okay. They have negative reactions to the negative feelings, and then they bring coping that makes shit a lot worse. This happens all the time. Okay. And it's the coping, I like to say, is like it's like water on a grease fire. Okay. And then the water on the grease fire causes things to spread. So what's an example? So you get a depressive individual, okay, who comes in. I hope that my adjustment to college is going to go well. Okay. And I better do it, because, and then they get there and they try to go to a party and they talk awkwardly to somebody. And the first midterm comes back a C. And by the time they're 6 to 8 weeks in college, they're like, this had to have gone well. What the hell is wrong with me? This sucks. I'm never going to be able to adjust. Okay. Notice, so now you're in a negative situation, you get negative feelings, and then the system, the justificatory system goes haywire on it. Okay. And then that causes the feeling system to be like, oh my God, this is fucking hopeless. And so then it gets all withdrawn. And the system is like, now I'm ineffective. I can't even go to class. What the hell's wrong with me? So now the blaming system is now piling on to a shutting down system. And you get what's called a depressive disorder, where the justification system is being hijacked in a pessimistic way, creating self-blame, turning against the self, as the felt primate system is now like, I can't get anybody to take care of me. And my rider, the ego on top of my horse, hates me. So now I'm just a helpless fucking child. And so I'm doing nothing but sitting in bed. So now you get the ego at war with the experiential self, okay, which is the central cognitive insight of the pessimistic, helpless learner. And then the system itself is getting just this iterative process. So that's an example of the different domains of systems. And by the way, our current society is totally set up in a bad way that makes this very likely to happen. Okay. So you get, and that's why we're seeing massive increases in anxiety and depressive disorders for a whole host of reasons I could get into. So essentially, bottom line, what's depression? So we should describe it as a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Makes perfect sense if you understand behavioral investment theory and the way organisms, animals, and primates act in the world and the way our structure is. That is what description, we can then ask, what gives rise to the shutdown? What kinds of developmental environmental structures? What kinds of agent arena adaptive structures or maladaptive structures? And what is the biophysiological architecture and where is it in relationship to this? And you get depressive diseases, depressive disorders, depressive reactions. And you're like, oh, that's what depression is. Okay. And it just makes perfect sense. And my last thing I'll say is, like, I'm passionate about this. We talk about meaning mental health crisis. The depression is the #1 cause in the world of disability. Okay. It's the #1 cause of disability. So, and we don't even know what it is. We can look at Jordan Peterson, take his clips and be like, okay, guys, so what is it? Well, it's this complicated possible thing, blah, blah, blah. It's like, if you have the rights, it's a state of behavioral shutdown. Oh, it has reactive structures. It has maladaptive elements. It's got biophysiological elements. It makes perfect sense. It's amazing then that this #1 cause of disability is so confused. And it's just an example of why the problem of psychology is so important.
Well, I mean, that's probably why treatment but diagnosis is so difficult, right? That there are lots of different paths to behavioral shutdown. There's lots of different ways in which negative affect can increase and desire and motivation can decrease. Like you said, like you can be struck by lightning, and if you're struck by lightning, your negative affect is going to go up right away in the flash of a second. Or you can be exposed to terrible socioeconomic, political situations, and the rate of change there will probably be different. Maybe there'll be reciprocal dynamics, like John points out, and then there are all these different paths.
Right. And you want to know, in terms of institution, postmodern critique, what we did was we decided that there were natural, non-human causes to the world, and we call that medicine. And medicine then is different because we don't hold you responsible. Once we diagnose you medically, that means it's operating at the living organism plane and mechanistically causing shit, and your culture person plane's not responsible. Okay. So then we grant psychiatry, which is a medical discipline, diagnosing all of these things, which then means institutionally, you have to decide whether this is not the person's fault at all and caused completely independently of who they are and reduces to biological breakdown, or is then caused by who they are and problems in living, and then is not a medical problem at all. Notice then the institutional categories preordain an inability to define what the hell the thing is because it doesn't reside in those kind of categories that we built based on the error of the Enlightenment gap, where we thought, oh, there's matter and biology, and then there's mind out here. These two totally different things. And there's no, it's either or. And of course, it's not either or at all. But there you go. That's part of the history as to why you're sort of like, so the institution of postmodern, the institution is actually broken. It's already given the authority to define the thing by an institution that has to define the thing as a disease. It's a preordained, like where we got troubles,
I mean, like,
So, anyway.
just from a popular perspective, I think the way that people think about medicine is just that there's a mechanism in your body that's working, it breaks, you have to fix or replace it. Like, it's like a car. There's a part in your car that breaks, you got to fix or replace it. There's just no way to apply that beyond the life plate. You can't think of mental mechanisms the same way.
Absolutely. We do it with ADHD. We do it. I mean, this is the way in which our mental illness models then are applying are creating so much sickness and confusion at just an epistemic level of like what we are, who we are. And again, that's why the problem of psychology is so unbelievably important, is because the academy hasn't given lay people a proper model just for sense making. It creates this division of, well, that's not you at all. That's your ADHD. It's like, I mean, the in nonsense in relationship to those claims is just astronomical. Yet the institution is structured to behave that way, and it's tragic.
Yeah, really is. Because as you said, it's such an important problem, and it'll continue to be likely into the future.
And that we're seeing rates of opioid use, suicide, adolescent anxiety shooting through the roof, folks. This is not going away. And the number of people that are suffering because of a misalignment of how they understand themselves in the world is just makes me want to weep.
Yeah, it's brutal.